good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. Nice to see you, Cameron. There's a chat coming in through. So thank you everyone for joining our webinar on how boards of directors can engage in ethics and compliance. My name is Emily Miner. I'll be moderating today's discussion. And before we jump into things, I'm going to share a few housekeeping notes. We have a Q&A box down in the kind of the bottom banner next to the chat box. So if you have any questions throughout today's session for either of the panelists, or if you just want to share your own experience that's relevant to the topic, please feel free to drop that in. We'll be monitoring that as we go so that this can be an interactive conversation. The Compliance Certification Board has approved this event for up to 1.2 CEUs based on your attending the entirety of the event. So if you, you should receive a certification in an email after the event concludes. If you don't receive that email, Carol, do they follow up with the certification board, or do they follow up with us?
They should be able to. Sorry, we will have it in the follow-up email, and if they don't receive it, then they can reach out to me or info@lrn.com.
Okay, thanks. And then finally, we have some polling questions that we'll be doing throughout this webinar. So please be sure to participate in those polls. It'll help kind of shape the conversation and is another way for us to get feedback. Okay, so in case you are new here, I just want to give some quick background on LRN. We've been around for over 27 years, providing ethics and compliance solutions motivated around our mission of helping people around the world do the right thing. We offer advisory services, which is my little corner of the LRN world, SaaS education, analytics, custom learning, codes of conduct, and a lot more. We also conduct regular research into ethics and compliance program effectiveness, culture, and leadership. And this webinar, in fact, is coming in hot on the heels of our latest Insights publication, which I think was just released yesterday, that's about this very topic, the role and impact of boards on ethics and compliance. So I'm excited to be having this live conversation to bring some of that to life and kind of explore how these dynamics are playing out in organizations. Our conversation today is structured as kind of a both sides of the coin conversation. I'm joined by Cameron Hoffman, who's the Chief Compliance Officer for NORTONLIFELOCK. So she's representing the ethics and compliance perspective, and David Greenberg, who is a sitting director at International Seaways, representing the board perspective. And we'll do a quick round of introductions first. Since I'm already talking, I'll go first. Again, Emily Miner, I'm a senior advisor in our ethics and compliance advisory practice. I lead our ethical culture services track, as well as much of our thought leadership activities, including the report that I just mentioned. Been in the culture and behavior space for over a decade. Before that, I did some things in the environmental sector, including international climate policy, and I had a stint in academia. So Cameron, I'm going to turn it over to you and then to David for some introductions.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Cameron Hoffman, as you mentioned, Chief Compliance Officer of NORTONLIFELOCK. So that's the Norton antivirus brand and the LifeLock identity protection brand. I started as a defense attorney and then did some time at the SEC as an enforcement attorney, and particularly in the FCPA unit, so focusing on anti-corruption cases. And now I'm responsible for the broad purview of what you would typically consider in the ethics and compliance portfolio. And I also run export controls, privacy, product legal, and go-to-market legal.
Thanks, Cameron. David.
So I'm David Greenberg, and I think for purposes of today, the most important thing is that I'm a sitting director at a public company, member of the audit committee, and chairman of the governance and risk assessment committee. I also spent many years on the other side of the table as a chief ethics and compliance officer. And I'm also leading a effort under LRN's umbrella for Tapestry Networks, where we've been in discussions with about 60 public company directors about the oversight of ethics, compliance, and culture, and how that's going and how it can improve. So that's me.
Thanks. Okay, so you've heard from us. We want to hear from you. We've got our first poll, and we want to get a sense of the audience. So please select your role. And thank you, Carol, for pulling that up. Okay, do we have the results? Wonderful. Okay, so we've got a pretty good distribution across kind of the both sides that I mentioned, the compliance and ethics side, as well as the board side. Okay, so thanks for that. Okay, and another person from internal audit. Thank you. Okay, so let's dig in. At some point, we will probably be able to start conversations without referencing COVID, but this is not yet that time. So one of the things that this past year and a half has taught us is that there's really no longer a regular course of business in business. We've got simultaneous economic, environmental, social, and health crises that have really upended business as we know it. And at the same time, we have companies that are, or companies are being kind of increasingly expected to deliver on commitments to their purpose, to their values, people, society, the planet, as well as elevated standards for workplace conduct. So given these dynamics, the multiple crises and the ever higher bar for organizations, what is the obligation of the board in this new world? And specifically, at least as far as our conversation is concerned, what is their obligation when it comes to ethics, compliance, and culture? So Cameron, I want to start by hearing from you. What are some of the ways that your board at NortonLifeLock engages on these topics? And how do they send signals that ethics, culture are things that matter?
Yeah, so I think that we did have a good mix of folks attending, and so I assume that there's some standards for how boards engage. So the quarterly meetings, handling senior level escalations, executive sessions with folks like me and folks like the individuals join us from internal audit to hear one-on-one, in terms of concerns and get a pulse on things. I think our board also does a really good job of participating in the program in more visible ways. And one of the examples that's been really helpful during the pandemic is our employee resource groups will have events or different employee all-hand type events, and they will show up in those and speak to culture and speak to their journey and their experience so that the company can get to know them as people and understand a little bit more about where they come from and their experience. We also do a live in-person annual code of conduct training with our full board that I lead, and I find that to be a really good time to discuss situations that have come up or give some real hypotheticals and get input. And I can take those back into the employee trainings and say, one of the examples we discussed at the board level was this, and this is how they would expect us to handle it. And then another way that they send a pretty clear signal is when we have senior level hires, I get looped in to have an initial welcome to the company. Here's the expectations. We highly value ethics and compliance and culture, and here's how I can support you as you come into the company. And I think that really helps, particularly at the very senior levels, to set the expectations with folks coming in that this is an important priority for our company.
Mm-hmm. I love that, and particularly kind of attending those the employee events. I feel like in so many organizations, the board is kind of this behind the scenes. Maybe you know them if you happen to go to the director's page on your company website, but that's really the only interaction that the vast majority of employees are going to get with directors. But yours have really kind of taken that to a next level. Thanks for sharing that.
So Emily, if I could just add on the signals piece, I think, the organizational justice piece that's in the report is incredibly important. And I think that one happens more behind the scenes, but I do think holding the senior leaders accountable, that's a real clear example. And also the resourcing of the, ethics and compliance function is another visible way to make sure that, the right, both the quantity and quality of staffing and resources is a pretty good way to show that you have the endorsement of the board.
Absolutely. David, kind of from your perspective on the audit committee, chairing the governance committee, how are you sending signals to International Seaways, or the leadership team of International Seaways, that ethics, compliance, culture are things that matter? What kind of questions are you asking?
Well, I'd say the first thing that being on a board and being chair of a committee has given me is the opportunity to try to make a point about where ethics and compliance fits in priorities. And, I'm in control of the agenda of the committee that oversees ethics and compliance, and I'm on the other committee that looks at, say, financial issues that may bear on ethics and compliance. And so the one thing I've tried to ensure is that we addressed ethics and compliance both as a formal agenda item and also in the context of other agenda items. Because I think one of the insights LRN has had for a long time is the idea that ethics and compliance needs to be built in, not bolted on. When the ethics and compliance program is simply a program, as opposed to a part of the way of doing business, you're starting from, a set of barriers, because programs come and go and business goes on every day. And so one of the things I've tried to do also is work with the chairman of the Compensation and Human Resource Committee to make sure that ethics and compliance plays an important role in each of the senior teams' objectives for the year. And we've asked each of the senior team members of International Seaways to think about how she or he can best carry out their obligation to help shape an ethical culture and to adopt some very specific objectives for the year and come back and report at the end of the year on those objectives. So that's part of the way of sending an important signal.
David, you're in kind of a unique position in that you're a former chief ethics and compliance officer, and there aren't many directors out there that kind of have the same or similar background to you, although the numbers are growing. So, I guess it makes sense to me that you're kind of keyed into this idea of ethics and compliance being operationalized in the company, and that's informing your approach. But what about other directors, whether that's other directors on your board, or perhaps to get even bigger numbers? You mentioned the Tapestry study a little bit earlier, and so I think as part of that, you said that you've talked to about 60 sitting directors of publicly traded companies. What are some of the trends that you're hearing from those conversations?
So Emily, I think there's really good news from all of that, and then there's some other kind of news. The good news is that directors, almost to a person, are aware of and concerned about corporate culture, and think that one of their jobs is to help promote a healthy, ethical corporate culture. I would say the other news is they're not quite sure what that means, or how to do it, or how to measure it, and how to act on it. They're not quite sure who ought to be responsible for that other than the CEO and the whole senior team. And as we discussed corporate culture in the tapestry dialogue and summit, one of the things that's been clear is that it's a topic that touches everything, and because of that can get lost if there's not a way to focus attention on it. So I would say that there's been a lot of talk about how do we develop a real explicit strategy for culture, who ought to be responsible for that, and how do we execute against it, and how do we measure it?
Yeah, it's interesting, like your good news and then the other kind of news. There was a Heidrick and Struggles recently, or earlier this year, surveyed, I think, about 500 CEOs specifically on the topic of culture and its impact on performance. And they found that, the vast majority of CEOs said, yes, culture is something that is important and we're focused on it. But then when asked, what are primary drivers of financial performance, culture didn't make the top three for a lot of those CEOs. So there's this gap of, yes, it's really important, but how is it shaping sort of the business metrics that we care about? And one of the other findings from this study that I just found so powerful, and it connects with a lot of other research as well, is that the CEOs that they call culture accelerators, so ones that think culture is important but are also doing things about it, they have a financial performance kind of measured by a 3-year revenue compound annual growth rate that is more than double that of other organizations or other the companies of the other CEOs surveyed. So I think that just goes to show how relevant culture is. I mean, we all know that, or I think most of us know that, but then what do you do about it? How do you shape it? How do you measure it? There's less of a definitive or collective kind of understanding of that. I want to get some insight from the audience about your board, or if you are a director, from whatever perspective you're answering. Carol, do you mind pulling up the second poll? And I think the third answer choice is supposed to be, we report to our board, a committee, but they don't ask many questions. So there's a missing word there. Okay. And what are the results?
Let's just wait 10 more seconds. People are still answering.
Thanks, Carol. Okay. Yeah. This is great. So, half of those who answered the poll said the board is very focused on ethical culture. And then, it looks like we have kind of the other half. There's, maybe less active engagement on this topic. And, a few years ago, LRN did a kind of a related study that looked at the role of boards from the perspective of chief compliance officers and chief ethics and compliance officers. And I remember one of the themes from that was just that boards are so busy. There's so many priorities on their agenda, and so sometimes it's not for a lack of care, but just a lack of capacity and time. So that's something that boards increasingly have to navigate and balance. So thanks for sharing that. So I want to get a little more tactical here. And before we do that, one more poll. Carol, do you mind pulling up the third one? So some of the topics discussed in your board committee meeting, and I'm going to emphasize that word discussed. So not part of the pre-read documents, or I mean, it can be both, but you know, what do you actually talk about? And obviously in, you know, quarterly meetings, there are, as I've just mentioned, many topics on an agenda. So this is kind of specific to the ethics and compliance world, not to suggest that boards are not also discussing and focused on, you know, other metrics, of course.
We're still getting a few more in, so I'll share the results as soon as they stop.
Okay. So we've got a lot of kind of reporting type responses, training, stats, status of ENC initiatives, hotline reports, regulatory requirements, obviously an important one. And then let's see, what's the trends in ethics and compliance? A little less focus on culture specifically, M&A activity, root cause analysis. Thank you, I appreciate that, that's really helpful. So kind of following on the results of that poll, Cameron and David would love to kind of understand a little bit more what the communication looks like between kind of ethics and compliance and the board. And, you know, Cameron, you talked earlier about obviously quarterly meetings and your annual code of conduct, live training, you know, being brought in for senior manager hires. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the formal and informal communication channels between you and the board?
Sure. So in terms of the formal reporting, you know, I thought that last poll was really interesting because basically what it shows is for ethics and compliance, I think we're emphasizing the more boring part of our reporting and spending less time on what might be more interesting for the board. And so I you know, that to me is quite interesting. I do a presentation, obviously, that includes a PowerPoint, but I have reduced that to very visually interesting dashboards that trends pop out on. So trying to look over time. And I submit that as a pre-read so that it's not me going through my deck saying, and then we had 12 reports and we, you know, I try and use the discussion time to talk about the things that only 25% said. So the root cause, the why, you know, the trends that are happening, the things that are coming up, the way that M&A is impacting us, the way, you know, looking forward a bit. I think that's just infinitely going to be more interesting. And so, you know, to follow on to David's point earlier about, you know, the built-in or bolt-on, the why is ethics and compliance. The how is leadership and C-suite, and we're going to execute on this and we're going to do that and we have this initiative, but the why. And so the more time you spend, you know, both yourself, but also getting your other executives to talk about the why of the decisions they're making, you're actually having a culture discussion at all times that's focused on the ethics and compliance, because presumably they're trying to do it for the right reasons. So I do think keeping the deck as something that you submit as a pre-read, and if there's questions, great, and then having a more live animated discussion is probably, you know, a little bit more interesting and engaging for the board. In terms of the non-formal communications, I use every method available to me. So text, you know, Zooms, phone calls, anything and everything. Hey, there's this article I saw, this is interesting, this may impact us for this reason, or I wanted to make you aware of this thing. Or when I do get feedback or questions at the board level on a presentation or a topic or initiative, and I get to the draft part of that, you know, executing it, send it as a, hey, heads up if you have any input or thoughts on this, because I think that can be really important. And then also, I saw we have internal audit participating as well, some of the attendees. I think a strong partnership between ethics and compliance and internal audit can help enhance those communications, because you can double down on each other's messages, understand what's going on in each other's programs, and kind of help reinforce the priorities that are facing, the compliance arena more broadly for your company.
And do you, in those, so you talked about your strategy for your quarterly reports and not focusing so much on your deck, but what's kind of do you find that the board, are they engaging with you? Are they asking questions? You kind of have to lead them to the water. Is it varied depending on the person? Because I think that was another theme from the research that we did a few years ago, was that, and I love that you talked about the why, because that kind of came out as a gap, that, there can be some confusion around the why of ethics and compliance. And ethics and compliance, if you look at kind of the different corporate functions, is a newer one, right? That boards are kind of having to wrap their heads and arms around. So yeah, do you see a two-way dialogue or a multi-way dialogue, or what does that look like?
So I see a two-way dialogue, but I will tell you, when there's, board members that don't engage with me, or we have board turnover or something like that, I view that as my missed opportunity, not theirs. And I view it as my job in my specific function to help teach the board members how to ask me the tough questions and the smart questions. And so, I will plant it myself. I will say, I'm going to talk to you about this. And then the hard question for me at the end is going to be X. Right. And I try and do it at the beginning so that they kind of know what they're listening for. Like, we have to do initiative, and I'm certain you're going to ask me blank. All right. After I tell you about this, because, I think it's a missed opportunity if we're not being completely open, kimono, the hard things, the easy things. I think, just taking victory laps or reporting out stats, in a super boring way is not going to help anybody, because these are experts. These are people who care deeply about the company. They have a broader purview, and being able to really engage them on some of the topics and start that dialogue is going to be constructive for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. David, what about you? Formal, informal communication between, you as a director with your ethics and compliance function?
Yeah, I think first I just want to comment on what Cameron said. And my essential comment is that I'd like to clone her and her relationship with her board and pollinate the rest of the director, the board, ethics and compliance universe with that relationship, because, she's clearly got an A+ kind of situation. Historically, and still today, I think the ethics and compliance reports to boards tend to put boards to sleep, purely and simply. The board plays a strategic role, and most other executives who report to boards and have discussions with boards are engaged in an elevated strategic discussion about the course of the company, its path, its future, its strengths, its weaknesses. Reporting on activities really goes against the grain. So I think that the relationship between boards and ethics and compliance needs to be elevated, needs to be more strategic. I think Cameron has the right idea that it's the chief ethics and compliance officer's job to do the best she or he can to elevate that relationship. You simply, if you can't get to, are we living up to who we want to be in what we see in terms of behavior and outcomes, you're not having the right conversation. And I've said to CECOs that it's time for the community to play big and not miniaturize itself. When we talk about how many people we've trained, when we talk about the calls to the helpline, if you're doing that in isolation without getting to the big picture of what's sort of the state of behavior in the company and where do we need to move and how do we move, you're not having the right conversation. So for my board, that's the conversation that we want to have. What are the gaps in our culture that are leading to instances of misconduct? And not only what do we do about those instances of misconduct, but what do we do about the bigger machine? And how do we incorporate our values into the machine so that day-to-day behavior is driven by those values? So that's the conversation that we need to get to, and that's the conversation that will bring many directors alive as opposed to put them to sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it reminds me of my favorite line from the DOJ's update back in 2019 was, does your program work in practice? And to me, the way that I interpret that is like, how are people behaving and making decisions on a daily basis? Like that's what working in practice means. And so, the best training, the best kind of helpline system, reporting system is really, it only goes so far if you don't have a culture that kind of wraps around all of that and that is supporting and setting those expectations for people for what behavior, what values-based behavior looks like, behavior in line with our purpose. How do we make decisions in line with our purpose and values? I want to bring in a comment that was added by Michelle. And Michelle Moyer, are you the Michelle Moyer? I hope so. It's so nice to see your name pop up. General Counsel, yes. So Michelle is General Counsel for Associated Students UCLA, the student union on the UCLA campus. Our board is a majority student board, and they demand that ethics and compliance, as well as a healthy and engaged culture, be front and center in terms of our business strategy and objectives. It's fascinating to be in this position, and as you can imagine, I enjoy it very much. Yeah, and that kind of connects to another comment that was dropped in, and which says that culture is a huge thing, kind of connecting it to millennials at work wanting new ways of doing things. But then the tension, as this attendee is highlighting, between people that want to kind of keep on doing things the same way that they've been doing for 20 years. And this person writes, our ENC wants to do something, but don't know how to bring together kind of the both sides, the disruptors and the let's not fix what's not broken, or however that goes. Another issue is that nobody wants to share information, thinking that owning information gives you power. So how do we break that?
Can I jump in on that, Emily?
Please.
Lead by example. Open your kimono. Give every bit of information that you have to anybody that you're trying to partner with, right? Be a millennial, be the change you want to see in the world, to use that expression, right? That's out there. Because I do think, there's huge gaps between the way that different generations engage with the ethics and compliance culture. And particularly in the tech space, we see that a lot of companies out here are predominantly younger generation workers. And so things like how you interact on an investigation, my generation and before, now I sound old, right, would keep it quiet. You don't want anybody to know somebody's investigating you at work. That would be, kind of viewed as something embarrassing. No, millennials group source whether they did it wrong. Like, oh, I got a call from HR. Here's what I did. What do you all think? Right. And so you have to communicate your expectations around confidentiality and the why that you're asking for confidentiality in a different way with that younger generation, so that they understand that the purpose of doing that is to try and minimize business disruption and not impugn anyone before there's been a finding, as opposed to them thinking like, oh, it's just a cabal and everybody's keeping things quiet. So I would say you do have to really understand those generational differences and the way that they're going to engage with the ENC program. the older generation wants to see low metrics of investigations. So you have to teach them. That's not actually good. Like investigation metrics are a per employee metric, and you should expect to have a certain amount. And if you don't, the events are still happening out there. You're just not collecting them adequately. So teach that. On the flip side, millennials want the stories about like what happened. So you get a newsletter going about like, can you believe they did this? And you anonymize it and you get your employment lawyers okay with it, right? And then you put it out there to say like, this happened, in this anonymized way. But I would say once you start communicating with both, you become able to translate that culture and bring it together. But on the information sharing piece, like, do it, lead. Right? Like, just show that the sharing of information is power, and show that your program gets stronger when people rely on you to be a source of information that they can use. Provide whatever metrics anybody wants anywhere, because there's no secret to what we do. It's not proprietary to how I do it. Trying to be that. So to David's example, I report to the audit committee. That's my dotted line. But in nominating corporate governance, I send them my HR metrics because they do payment. They do, set the pay scale for our executives. They should know. They should know what our culture looks like on the back end in terms of how that plays out in investigations. So that's my perspective is, try and understand what motivates the different generational cultures and speak to them each. But in terms of information, don't ever hide anything. It's not going to give you any more power. It's just going to cause other people to behave the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work with a lot of organizations kind of in my role at LRN, trying to help them understand where is your culture, where do you want it to be, how do you get there? And consistently, a big piece of feedback that we hear from employees is around this idea of transparency. We want to know, and we also want to know when things went wrong. Like, let's talk about that too. And this idea of you mentioned organizational justice earlier. What we find is that organizational justice processes are often kind of a black box to people. And maybe you've communicated about it, maybe you haven't, but if you have, people haven't read it or whatever, so they don't know what happens. So, I'm reluctant to report because what happens after that? And, how am I going to be protected and things like that? And so, we always advocate for how can you bring in more transparency and more storytelling around that, whether you're reporting kind of annual metrics, whether you're bringing in anonymous, case studies, incorporating those into your training, how can you do that? And there's a lot of, there's often a lot of reluctance to kind of explore those ways of communicating about, because there's this idea of, no, we're not supposed to talk about it. And there's confidential information. And so, we could get in trouble. And of course, like that needs to be respected. But there are so many examples out there of really creative ways of sharing this information without sharing the things that you can't share. So I'm glad that you kind of picked up on that. David, anything that you want to add to kind of this question, sort of the two-part question around the generational differences, or it might not even be generational, but just mindset differences, and then kind of internally information hoarding or information as power?
Well, I think part of the question came from the point of view of we want to be more strategic. We want to have the right relationship with the board and talk about the right things, get to the whys, get to the question of culture and strategy and filling the gaps, but we don't know how to do it, or we don't have cooperation in doing it. My suggestion there is that you prepare a presentation and discussion of what good looks like today. And for example, what regulators like the Department of Justice expect. And I think if you are faithful to that, you have a lot of tools to kind of elevate the conversation. Because Emily, as you said, the focus now from a regulatory point of view and a prosecutorial point of view is what we are doing in ethics and compliance making a difference. And in order to show that and measure that, you really have to be talking about the whys and the overall culture and what you're going to measure and how you're going to move those numbers. So, you know, I think, for example, take the last couple of PEI reports from LRN, which shows what more effective programs do compared to less effective programs. Take the study that the Tapestry Network just published with LRN on the state of board oversight of culture, ethics, and compliance. And you'll find plenty of evidence there of the kind of relationship and the kind of conversation and the kind of approach you ought to be taking with your board.
David, you mentioned what's the impact it's having on the business, and that is a great segue to our next poll question. Carol, if you could pull that up. And there are many ways that ethics compliance impacts the business. This is but one. So if you could answer, has your organization's consideration of E&C risks or factors led to modifying or abandoning a business initiative? Yes, no, not applicable, not sure. Okay. Thanks everyone for answering this. This was actually one of the questions that we asked in our latest ethics and compliance program effectiveness study that David just mentioned. And we found that 46% of the respondents, this is coming from a respondent pool of about 630 people all around the world, but 46% said yes to that question. This is when we removed the not applicable respondents because they were not applicable. But we found that when, when we kind of took that 46% and we broke it down a little bit more, we found that when senior executives know that their board will hold them accountable for behavior, when there's kind of demonstrated evidence of that, we found that that number rose pretty significantly to over 60%, whereas when a board had less of a focus on senior level behavior, only 20% of that time did consideration of ethics and compliance risks, substantially impact a business initiative or business decision. So I think that's pretty powerful. We were talking about signals earlier, and that is certainly one of them. Okay, we've got about—
It is, Emily, but only if you talk about it, right? I mean, right. All those folks that were not sure, I mean, that's a huge opportunity to get better involved in the business decisions and understand what's being made. And when a business decision is impacted by an ethics and compliance consideration, talk about it. Right? Use that. Say, we made this great decision not to do this thing, or there was this example that came up and here's how it factored in. But the only way that you're going to be able to kind of gather those examples and have that discussion is to be aware of what's going on in the business and be involved in it and understand that ethics and compliance should intersect with pretty much everything you do, right? There should be a risk tolerance discussion that is iterative and ongoing in all activities that kind of aligns that to the ethics and compliance function.
Absolutely, yeah. And going back to storytelling and transparency and information sharing. I mean, talk about it kind of within the leadership, but also kind of at the organization level too. Okay, so I want to kind of turn for our last. We want to leave some time for Q&A. So, talking about some missed opportunities that for the ethics and compliance function when it comes to engaging with your board on these topics. David and Cameron, you both already mentioned things like, just talking about the boring statistics, or not teaching your board kind of how to ask you smart questions. What are some other I think David, you said not kind of playing big. What are some of the other missed opportunities We had, I think it was 20%, the majority of the people on this call are in the kind of the E&C function side of things, 20% were CECOs. So what are some of the tips and tricks that you have for your peers on this webinar?
So I would say don't duck and cover. In your opportunity to talk to the board, don't try and get in, get out, no questions. Like that is a loss. If you're not getting asked questions, plant them, put them in there, tell them what they should be asking you, and hold yourself accountable. I do think that the compliance is also compliance, right? It's something that a lot of people don't want to hear about or have a negative association with it. So speaking in the language of the business is going to be a lot more effective for communicating. Figure out the key culture and business terms that are used a lot in your space and use them for ethics and compliance as well. So the example I give is, we're in a consumer business, so it's about getting people into a subscription and an auto renewal for identity and antivirus products. Friction comes up a lot about the getting people through that journey. And so when we rolled out a new code of conduct that matched on aligned to our business, I talked to the executives about how this reduced friction for employees and understanding our values and our policies. It's that, speaking the business language in your space makes you part of the business, and that's exactly where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that I hear a lot from people in the ethics and compliance spaces. We're seen as the no people, and this the shift from being seen as the no people to being seen as the partners in how we do business. And so using the language of the business is a really great tip. David, anything you want to add to that? Missed opportunities, tips?
I would say try everything you can to begin or continue a conversation about the culture, how to measure it, and what to do about it. Maybe pivoting off, a learning opportunity based on one incident and a bit of a root cause analysis of what went on. I think that until we're having a conversation about what's the level of fear in this company, what's the level of trust? Do we have one system of justice for the senior people and great performers and another for the regular grassroots? How do we know whether we're living our purpose and values, and how in the world could we measure that? That's the conversation that will over time really elevate ethics and compliance and really improve and strengthen the relationship between the board and the ethics and compliance function. If you're having trouble doing that, take time in the strategy part of the year to propose a kind of new strategy for board engagement, a new strategy for things that the board ought to be looking at. Try to see which members of the board are interested enough in the topic to have a kind of offline relationship. There's not enough time in board sessions or even committee sessions to really do everything that needs to be done. Some of it needs to be offline. You can bet that the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel all have relationships with the board and board members that exist outside the board and committee rooms. And ethics and compliance needs to get itself into that sort of frame and that sort of relationship.
Yeah, it's kind of, David, I'm gonna do a follow-up for you. Tips for the directors. So there were, I think, a little less than 20% of the people on this call identified as being a director. So what are your tips for them?
Well, I would say, one is the out of meeting relationship. Can I sit down with you as an E&C leader and function and really learn what your strategy is and how we could, maybe elevate it. I would say, you know, here's my understanding of what we are measuring. What should we be measuring? What are we missing?
Mhm.
And, you know, I would, as a director, I would say to the SECO, if we want to have or understand what the company's explicit culture strategy is, who do I need to have in a room to have that conversation? Because it may be more than the SECO, but the SECO can certainly play a role in that. So, you know, I think from what I can tell from talking to all of the board members who've been involved in the tapestry study, which is probably more than 10% of the Fortune 500, there's interest in this, there's passion about it, there's willingness, but there's not always the ways and means. And so together between boards and ethics and compliance leaders, we've got to sort of forge a path of how to get the right conversation going.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a little less than 10 minutes, so I want to turn it over to our participants for your questions, your comments. If you have, you know, some success stories or strategies that have worked well for you, please share those as well. It doesn't have to just be questions, in the spirit of transparency and information sharing. Okay, we've got a question here. Can you talk about the experience of COVID? Did that change the dynamic between ethics and compliance and the board at all? And if so, how?
And so I can jump in on that one. You know, so obviously it makes the basic changes if you're not sitting around a boardroom, you know, you're doing it virtually. But I also think it made people more accessible. People learned how to have more of a remote connection. And so I would say that I noticed the shift to the ability to text and pick up the phone in a more casual way. I think people are just more open to that now. So if folks haven't maximized that opportunity, they should do that. And I also think that ethics and compliance became more of a sanity check and a pulse on the culture, as opposed to, you know, for some board members, that's more of an HR discussion. But because there's less in-person, less visibility on that, I do think that there was an elevated opportunity to be a broader part of that discussion, because you see the tail of what's going on, or what goes wrong, or the root cause in those. I do think, though, in terms of building those personal connections that David talked about, it's a little bit harder if you have a new person in position, whether that's within ENC or at the board level, and it's all remote. You have to work a little bit harder. And so, you know, especially at the beginning, when we were all learning this virtual thing. Now it's, you know, people are accustomed to turn on your video, and that's as close as we're going to get, and all of that. But at the beginning, I think it was a little bit harder for those new relationships to cement.
But in some ways, you know, I love that we're learning more about each other because of the virtual setting. So, you know, seeing what our homes look like, our kids are interrupting, our dogs are barking. So there's you know, opportunities there as well.
Yeah.
Also, Emily, I also think that well, two things. Board members talk about this all the time. They really miss the personal one-on-one real contact. But one of my observations about this world, which I think is going to, this virtual world won't continue the way it is, but it's going to continue more virtual than it was before. I don't know I know very few companies that aren't going to be more flexible than they used to be. And one of my observations about operating virtually is it was much easier to get time with people, because people weren't killing hours and hours a day or days and days moving in between places where they couldn't be found. So when I've wanted to talk to other board members, it's much easier to find them. So I'd say try to take advantage of that. And then the other thing I'd say is that in this world where we're going to be out of the office more than we ever were before, at least pre-COVID, what's going to hold us together? Well, one of the things that's going to hold us together is our company values and our culture. And so it's another opportunity for the ethics and compliance community to play bigger.
Absolutely. We've got another question here. What would you say are the top 5 leadership skills of a culture accelerator CEO?
I would say listening, humility is a big one. Kind of rigorous commitment to truth, empathy. You know, Emily, you'll be familiar with this. Years ago, when in one of LRN's study of the relationship between culture and business outcomes, one question we asked was for people to characterize their culture, whether it was an ethical, values-based culture. And we came out of that with some interesting results. When you ask that to CEOs, something like 60% or 70% felt that their companies were manifesting an ethical, values-based, purpose-led culture. When you asked employees the same question, it was about 1/3 of that. So we labeled that the CEO delusion index. And I think it's pretty important for CEOs who want to lead in the right direction to not be victim of that delusion index and to get out there and understand what's really going on in the culture. You know, I spent 8 or 9 months of 2020 as CEO of LRN. And one of the things you learn as a CEO is you get everyone on their best day and their best behavior. And if you believe that that's how they are all the time, you're really missing a lot of reality. So how do you get out and understand that reality?
Yeah, I would add to that in terms of the leadership skills of you know, culture accelerator CEO. That CEO needs to be extraordinarily thoughtful about words, about how they describe initiatives, how they communicate, the examples that they pull into an employee all hands. And, you know, if you're strategic about those word choices, and if that's not natural to a CEO, there's obviously, you know, the ability to rely on the other folks who are there to support, like ethics and compliance and HR. But, you know, being able to use real-time example, real-time words, and demonstrate what David talked about, the listening and the empathy and the learning and the trust and the ability to understand that everybody, that, you know, the side you see isn't what everybody else sees. If you can bring that out in your language where people can actually hear it, and they're gonna understand that that's actually happening, as opposed to it just kind of happening behind the scenes. So making sure to pepper into each all hands an example that's thoughtfully procured, that, you know, has the goal of moving culture forward. Those kinds of use of language is going to be real effective.
Yeah, and you know, the kind of the flip side of the CEO delusion index is that leadership has an outsized impact on culture. And so to your point about being really thoughtful about that and appreciating that, acknowledging that, and respecting that, and being intentional in how you're showing up, how you're speaking, how you're interacting. Well, I think that is as good a note as any to end our conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, for participating in the polls and your questions. Don't forget to, there's a survey that you're going to get right after the webinar. We'd love to hear your feedback. What worked for you? What didn't work for you? What would you like to see us do differently? Be on the lookout for your CEU credit certification, and download our latest report on this topic about how boards can engage and lead in ethics, compliance, and culture. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday and an early happy weekend. And thanks, Cameron and David. This was awesome.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you.